Namaste, welcome to our Living Wisely, Living Well webinar this evening. My name is Nayaswami Devarshi. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswarji, beloved Guru, Paramhansa Yoganandaji, saints of all religions, we humbly bow at thy feet. O Divine Mother, help us to tune into thee in deep stillness, in the silence of our soul. May we hear thee, may we follow thee. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Each week we have a reading from Swami Kriyanandaji's book, Living Wisely, Living Well, in which he wrote just a very small, short passage for each day of the year. It's a very good way to go through an entire year and really garner a lot of wisdom and depth from this great saint. For today, April 3rd, the reading, if you have a good idea, it may be the better part of valor to discuss it with those only who share your ideals. Protect it from people who might jeer, simply because it fails to conform with their preconceptions. Let your confidence gain strength before exposing the idea to human goats who take pleasure in nibbling on other people's inspirations. So here Swamiji is advising that when you have an inspiration or an idea, don't overshare it with people who are not supportive of you, who are not in tune with the idea. I just really wonder how many great ideas, truly great ideas in history have been just shot down and discouraged because the person who had the idea shared it and someone discouraged or made fun of it and they just were embarrassed or walked away and thought, yeah, maybe it's a bad idea, and they never used it. And so just be very careful with how you talk and share your innermost feelings and inspirations. Yes, share with those who you really trust, those who are supportive, those who might understand. But just, I've learned over the years from much observation and also just in my own experience, just to be reticent in over-talking about new ideas and projects before they start to come to fruition, before the appointment has been made or the ticket has been booked or whatever, because you'll find that it loses some of its power also. In this similar vein, and I'm going to talk tonight about many different aspects of speech, of talking, of sharing, of silence, all these things, because you can only say so much about this particular thing that Swamiji says. But there's something that Paramhansa Yoganandaji taught. He said, when you have a deep inspiration, a deep experience, especially in meditation, he said, don't talk about it, don't share it. And I believe he meant don't share it with really anybody. You know, just, and what he said was it loses its power when you start talking about it. And I believe the reason why it loses its power when you have a deep experience, by putting it into words, you're basically distilling it or bringing it to just a very surface level of expression. And by just putting it into words, it really narrows it down and makes it much more shallow of an experience. And sometimes even in our own sharing of the experience, we dilute it and make it more shallow by giving it a definition when the experience is beyond words and beyond description and beyond the ability to describe it in such a very shallow kind of a way. The great Bengali saint Anandamayi Ma, she said that as long as we're talking, we are only on the surface of our minds, on the very, very surface. And so really, it is only in deep, deep silence and deep stillness that we really can experience God. And Yoganandaji was very keen on this idea of silence and stillness. Now, before I get into talking about silence and stillness, just this thought of not sharing our innermost divine experiences. And just be very careful with that. And just if you have any doubt, just don't share it at all. I have seen this, that following Yoganandaji's advice over the many decades I've been practicing these things, I've seen that in meditation classes very often, people will suddenly start sharing their experience and things that happened during their very first meditation as part of the class. And they'll talk about all kinds of crazy things and lights and sounds and inspiring things, seeing Krishna and this and that. And what I've seen over the years is very interesting, that those who talk the most about those experiences very rarely last very long in those meditation classes. Because again, they're only, as Anandamoyi Ma said, just on the surface. And sometimes even an experience just shared, it loses its power. And so be very careful about how you talk about such things. In fact, too much talking, period, is really a hindrance to going deep. We have a monastery here where I live with 7 of us monks. And it's Ananda, sort of a Dwapara Yuga monastery. It's very high energy. We do a lot of webinars, online classes, which we run almost like a business because we need to function that way in a very modern way, using the internet and paying the bills and doing all these things. But we also have a lot of time in silence. And we meditate as a group meditation. This doesn't count individual private meditation. We meditate together 3 to 5 hours a day. And then we have all of our meals in silence, which is what Paramahansa Yoganandaji asked of his monks. And so we spend many, many hours a day as a group together in silence. And it's a very, very interesting experience, because you will find that a group energy and a group magnetism is much more powerful when it is formed in deep stillness and deep silence, rather than just with talking. And yes, we also talk, we do our seva, and we go for a walk, and we talk, and we laugh, and all these things. But a good deal of the time, we are very inward and in silence together. And it's a very, very interesting experience. And this is why a lot of monasteries and spiritual traditions practice a lot of silence. I'm going to take this opportunity to tell a very dumb joke, which has no real meaning or importance, but it's about monks in silence. And it's about these 3 monks who shared a cell in a cave. They were in silence, and they were in silence for a few years, not speaking a word. And they were served a meal one day, and the meal wasn't very good. And one of the monks said, "This food is getting really bad." That's all he said. Then they went for another year. Nobody saying a word, complete silence. Finally, one of the other monks just couldn't hold it in anymore. And he said, "You talked, we're supposed to be in silence." That's all he said. Another year went by, nobody said a word. And finally, the 3rd monk, who also couldn't contain himself anymore, he finally blurted out after a year of silence, "I'm the only one who didn't say anything," is what he said. And so this is an old tradition, and it's a silly joke. But what we've seen is that when people can share in silence, they start to have an attunement with each other. And I've seen this. Now you might say, well, I'm married, couples, we need to talk all the time and this and that. Well, I can say you don't have to do that, because I was married for 25 years. My wife left the body about 10 years ago. And we spent a lot of our time in silence. We just didn't talk a lot. There just wasn't a whole lot to talk about. And we were both had a strong inner life. And we just found that we just were very comfortable, very happy, very joyful, spending a lot of time just simply in silence. And so there's a real power in silence. And we lose that concept, and we lose that idea and that experience with modern society, where it's just constant talking. The TV is always on, people are always talking. and it's just nonstop noise also wherever we live. And so really try to value and treasure the power of silence. I found this talking to Swami Kriyanandaji. He said once that there was a banquet, a dinner with the direct disciples of Yogananda, and Yogananda was hosting it. And there were a lot of outside guests came, people who didn't come very often to the ashram. And they were listening to Yogananda tell really funny stories and just regale them with humor, with joy, with inspiration on a very high energy level. And Swamiji said that one of the guests at the end of that said, wow, you people here are so lucky to have this energy and have the master talking like this all the time and so much joy and laughter. And Swamiji just laughed and he said, when he's with us, he's almost always in silence. And Swamiji said, when you were with the master, working in the garden or serving him in some way, he was mostly in silence. And the Yoganandaji said, he said, silence is the altar of God. And so you can really only truly experience God in that deep stillness and silence of the soul. What Swamiji wrote about this, he said about Yogananda, Yogananda said, only in silence can you really feel God's presence. When you allow the mind to become restless with thoughts and desires, then you bring yourself down to a level where God cannot communicate with you. And Swamiji added, God's body is space. If you want to feel him, you must feel space in your body and all around it. The same is true with silence. God's voice is silence. If you really want to commune with him, it must be done in the silence of your own mind and then in the silence of the infinite. In that silence, you will hear the voice of the infinite booming with the great power of Om all through creation. First, we must try to empty our consciousness of ego and then to refill it in a divine way. And just repeat this one sentence. If you really want to commune with him, it must be done in the silence of your mind. And God's voice is silence. So again, another reason not to talk too much about what we experience, ideas. Yes, it's good to share with people you are close to, but even then, try to have time to be in silence. Even I would recommend for people who are married or couples, have some meals in silence and have some time in silence and being with each other in silence. And you'll find that it really, in some unusual way, there's a communion that happens of two souls on a much deeper level, far deeper than can be done by just talking all the time. Now, just to get back to the subject of this reading, Swamiji said once about sharing ideas for inspirations that have not yet been really worked on. He said that Yogananda in 1950 told Swamiji, I want to take you to India with me on a trip, because he had only been back to India once since 1920. He went to India in 1936. And then every year for the next 2 years, he said the same thing. I want to take you to India with me. And I want you to go and lecture ahead of me and prepare people so that then I can follow up and be with people and meet a lot of people there and also give lectures there, is what Yoganandaji said. But he said to Swamiji, don't tell anybody I'm telling you this, because if you do, it can jinx it and it can lose its power and it can not happen just because of that. So again, be careful of the ideas and the inspirations you share or overshare, again, with the wrong people or the right people. One of the most, for some reason, one of the most memorable and unusual experiences that I had with Swami Kriyanandaji was when I was on his staff working for him. It was in the 1980s. And again, he would be in seclusion a lot. He would be in silence a lot. He would write notes. Sometimes he would take 1 to 3 or 4 months at a time. I have many notes that he wrote to myself and to my wife, Maria, when he was in seclusion. So he would not talk during those times. He would just scrawl, and it's very hard to read handwriting, write notes to us. It was very interesting seeing his consciousness when he was in silence, because I would have to do things in his house, his apartment, when he was in seclusion, in silence. So I would see him working or walking around. And there was a very deep power of incredible stillness and interiorization. Even the way he moved around was silent and very interiorized, very different from the public Swami Kriyananda that we were used to, who was projecting this big aura of magnetism and power and energy and strength. But one time he called me down into his apartment. He was not in seclusion, he was talking. And for some reason this stands out because it was a moment of silence where we just shared humor and joy without a single word passing between us. He called me down to his apartment and he said there was a snake in his apartment and he wanted me to catch it and remove it from his apartment. And I think he knew that I have a long history with snakes. I had a snake collection of wild snakes that I caught when I was a boy. And so snakes are my friends, and he just knew that, I think. So he called me down. And sure enough, it was a very, very friendly, very, very little snake. And so I grabbed it and caught it very easily. And then we went out to this little sort of a railing that had a drop off and an embankment outside his apartment. And I just gently tossed it out to let it go. And when I tossed it out, it sort of squirmed in the air and it looked like it was flying in the air the way it was moving. And we just both looked at each other like, did we just see the snake flying? Because it really looked like it was trying to fly in the air. And there was just complete silence, not a word, but just such a deep sharing of joy and humor over something that was trivial, but there was God's delight behind it. And we didn't need words to define it, to describe it. It was just a very beautiful inward moment. And so you will find that moments of silence very often can be very memorable and very meaningful and very poignant. I've seen this again in my own life. I've seen it in times when I've taken seclusion and I've been in silence for 2 weeks or so at a time. And you'll find that there is a very deep, deep stillness. God's voice is silence. And when we can be silent more, we can hear God's voice more. This is the power of why yogis and great yogis love to be in silence for long periods of time, and why some yogis even take vows of silence. So try to spend more time in silence, in meditation, in stillness, and less time talking at times. And even one day a week, try to take a day of silence. Mahatma Gandhiji, he would take a day of silence every week, no matter how busy he was. And it's very interesting in Autobiography of a Yogi, when Yoganandaji visited him, that was his day of silence. And it was a rule that he just never broke, even for a great master like Yogananda visiting him. And so he would write notes. I think the next day they talked to each other. But you would find that as a discipline, to just have a day of complete stillness and silence is very, very powerful, very effective tool for just resetting and rebooting our minds. Because again, if we're always talking and talking and talking, we're always on the surface of the mind only, as Anandamayi Ma said. I'm going to read a poem by Paramahansa Yoganandaji, and it is about silence. And you will find that great poetry comes from the depths of silence and stillness. And the beauty of words, again, if it's just on the surface, there's less depth. I have found that when I have to give public talks, which is fairly often, I find that it's really, really helpful to be silent for some time before I have to give a public talk. If I have to chat and chatter and sort of have light conversation, I find that it's more difficult to go deeper in my sharing when I have to speak. And I saw this again with Swami Kriyanandaji. I would drive him sometimes when he had to give a Kriya initiation or a talk. And he would be in complete silence, and you would not say a word when you're driving him to do a Sunday service talk, even a Sunday satsang, because there was a stillness and a depth that he was tuning into. And it was not a time for meetings or discussions or any of those things. It was just a time to be in stillness and silence with him. and support him in that, in a sense. And so you'll find that if you have to speak in some meaningful way, a presentation at your work, or a request for a raise or something like that, you'll find that if you are in silence for a while before that, your words have much more power for two reasons. One, I think it's almost like the fewer words you use, the more powerful they become. There's a very famous story about Saint Anthony of the Desert, who was in silence, and he was a hermit. And there was a great controversy in the church at that time about whether Christ was really the Son of God and was real and was this divine being. And so there was a huge argument. And some people thought he was just a man, an ordinary person who was a good speaker and this and that. Others thought he was this divine avatar in a sense. And so it was a great hubbub and commotion in this church where all these priests and bishops were discussing and perhaps arguing it. And so they called Saint Anthony of the Desert from his seclusion of many, many years, decades, he was in seclusion and silence. And they called him to speak and give his opinion on it. And he came into that church, and because he had such power, he got very silent. And he spoke. And he only spoke 4 words. Those 4 words he said were, "I have seen him." And when he spoke those 4 words, all discussion ended, all argument ended, the whole dispute ended. And he just said 4 words, "I have seen him." He didn't use reasoning. He didn't use argument. But his words had so much power because he never talked. And his words conveyed the power of his divine experience. And so the less we speak, the more powerful our words become. And so when you have to go into a situation where your words are important, try to be silent beforehand. Meditate, get very still, get the mind very still, and get out of this realm of words and thoughts. Because I have found that when I have to give a presentation or a talk, if I can be very still and go deeper, and not be thinking too much with my mind, with restless thoughts, and just go deeper, that what I have to share comes from a much deeper level. And I find that my words also have more meaning and also have more power. So I'm just going to read this poem of Paramahansa Yoganandaji's. And the title of it is My Cave of Silence. I love to roam in the forest of stars. I like to light the moon to dispel darkness. I light the golden sun to warm all with life. I put out the stars, sun, and moons. I switch off the lights of the universes and extinguish all candles of heaven. I put out all restless thoughts and senses when I am silent to be in ecstasy with my only beloved. I am the yogi who meditates not in little Himalayan caves, but in the soundless, darkless, lightless cavern of the skies, emptied of all disturbing, noisy, glittering creations. In the quiet bower of space, beloved and I dream love and bliss. And then sometimes planets, stars, like glowworms will glitter in the leaves of our thoughts. I drove demons and angels alike, ignorance and wisdom, restful and silent thoughts alike dismissed, that without disturbances, beloved and I may be together, love-locked forever. And so Yoganandaji actually recommended reading poetry and then meditating as a way of just getting into this more still, deep, intuitive state of mind. And so, again, coming back to the idea of words, how we use words, what we speak about, you'll find that if you just are always talking about trivial matters, your mind becomes more shallow, but you also can't be heavy and ponderous and, quote, overly spiritual all the time, You also have to be lighthearted and laugh and enjoy the strange, trivial things of this world and God's humor in certain ways. So we have to be ourselves. But you'll find that when you can come from a center of stillness and silence, you have more joy, you have more experience of God. Again, God's voice is silence. You will be able to meditate more deeply when you are habituated to just being somewhat more silent and more inward. Meditation becomes easier because the mind is already somewhat still and calm when you sit down to meditate. But if you've been talking nonstop all day, you sit down to meditate, the mind has so much momentum and so much chattering and going on that it's very difficult to calm it. One time, Swami Kriyanandaji said to Yogananda, he said, I have a very hard time when I meditate with calming my breath and calming my mind. And Yoganandaji said, that's because you used to talk a lot in past lifetimes. And then he added, but you enjoyed it. But he was paying the price for it later on by having difficulty in going deep and still in meditation. And of course, he got through that very quickly. But still, even on a day-to-day basis, the more we can go into stillness, into silence, at certain times of the day, certain periods in our life, try to find regularly times where you can go for a day, a week, or a few days a month, or take a couple weeks at a time, a week, if you've never taken such a long time, to be in silence. And you'll find that it's really extremely recharging on so many levels. It's creatively recharging because your mind goes very deep and still, and you start to have more creative inspirations and ideas for your life. In a way, it's just like almost like a hard reboot of your computer. It gets rid of all the old programs and stuff that are sort of chattering and hanging on and leaving all these little pieces of programming code and such that are just kind of making the memory get clogged up on the computer and slowing down the thinking process of the computer. So try more and more to work with silence, to work with stillness. I'm going to close by reading something from Swamiji's book, Affirmations for Self-Healing. And it's about peace of mind. And then we'll close with an affirmation. Peace of mind is the result, not of money in the bank, but of prayer and meditation. The more one contacts God in meditation, the more he feels descending upon him a blanket, as it were, of inner peace, cooling his body, calming his restless impulses, and thrilling his nerves with ever new delight. Peace is like a weightless waterfall, washing away all worries and bestowing a new, glad sense of confidence. Peace of mind is his who knows that God is his only treasury. And let's close with this affirmation that relates to this. And it relates to silence and the power of silence. Repeat after me, first loudly, and then I'll say it more and more quietly, and then take it more and more deeply, inwardly, and then we will repeat only mentally. From pools of inner silence, I sip the sparkling waters of thy peace. From pools of inner silence, I sip the sparkling waters of thy peace. From pools of inner silence, I sip the sparkling waters of thy peace. From pools of inner silence, I sip the sparkling waters of thy peace. And now whispering, from pools of inner silence, I sip the sparkling waters of thy peace. And now mentally only, from pools of inner silence, I sip the sparkling waters of thy peace. And if you can meditate now, meditate for 5, 10 minutes, half an hour if you can, and go deep into this stillness and into this silence, which is, as Yoganandaji said, the voice of God. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.